Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters, and anybody watching my YouTube channel on the Umayyads. I left you off with the Al-Andalusicans from the Umayyad revolution of 750, having pushed them back. Now, the quotations that I've got here, the literature of the Muslim conquest of Al-Andalus is vast and fairly uneven in quality. The classics account to E11 and Previs, HFMP, and Pro 89 is still a useful starting point. This I disagree with, simply because this is extremely heavy Christian apologism, and I've started to continue leading much of my readings of these books into the Al-Andalusicans from the chronicles of the Al-Andalusicans and several of the other poetries, and thereby making collaborations elsewhere. Personally, I don't consider much of what's written by the Christians apologists to be worth our time. And it goes into much of its sources in those two chapters that are basically, I've got for different opinions of sites, the Battle of Tyre, Conquest and Settlements, 880 to 890 by Shalametin, The Invasion and Islamization, page 132 144. Again, these references that are being used are incredibly Christianized. So when talking about the Al-Andalusicans, go back to the chronicles of Al-Andalusica, go back to the poetry, because the poetry will give you a feel of where they're moving from therein, and then make your citations away from that to examine each of the individual evidences as it goes. It's a bit long-winded. I've followed this discussion of Al-Sanus Governettes in Shalamate, Invasion and Islamization. Again, the invasion of Islamization is a heavily critical, calling the Christians corrupt and weak and cowardly, whilst calling them Muslims just lucky raiders. Again, this is a nuanceable misunderstanding. So, the Umayyad Emirates in 756 to 852, which is chapter 2 by Abdul al-Rashmid I, and the establishments of the Umayyads out here. The Umayyad family were members of the Prophet's tribe of the Qurayshans and distinct cousins of Muhammad himself. In the early days of Islam, the Umayyad chief Abu Sufyan had been one of the leaders opponents of the new religion, but following the triumph of Muhammad after 628, Abdul Sufyan's son Muawiyah rapidly became one of the most important figures in the early Muslim state. After the conquest of Syria, he was appointed the governor, and in 661, with the assassination of Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law Ali, he became the caliph of the entire Muslim world in 661 to 680. Muawiyah's direct line died out with his son Yazid in 684 after a vigorous civil war between the supporters of the Umayyads and their enemies. The caliphate was seized by Muawiyah's second cousin Marwan bin al-Hakim in 684 to 85 and his son Abdul al-Malik 685 to 705. So inaugurating a second Umayyad dynasty, sometimes known as the Mayawids. For half a century, the Umayyads ruled the whole of the Islamic world, from the Sinai and Samarkand in the east to the newly conquests of Al-Andalusica in the west. But there was always opposition from those who felt that the hereditary monarchy of a family who had been among Muhammad's leading enemies was un-Islamic, and those who resented the dominance of the Muslim world by the Syrian military support of the dynasty. From 747 to 750, there was a vast upheaval, the Abbasid revolution, which swept the Umayyads and their Syrian supporters from power. Most of the members of the ruling house were rounded up and executed, but a few, mostly less prominent individuals, were able to lie low and make their escape. One such was Abdul al-Rashid Malawiyah, a young grandson of the great Caliph Hisami, 724 to 43. After some harebrained escapes, he fled to North Africa, accompanied only by a few Mayawa, among them Badr, later to be his right-hand man in Andalusia. His first intentions seem to have been to secure Ifriti or Tunisia, but the governor, Abu al-Razvin al-Fiti, was hostile, and he was obliged to seek refuge among his mother's relations, the Nafisin Bedouins. Thwarted in Africa, he sent Badir to make contact with the Umayyad Mayawans amongst the Syrian Jundas in Al-Andalusia. There were said to have been 500 of them in the Dayawin, led by Ibn Bib Uthman and Ulal bin Khalid of Damascus and Yusuf bin Bakan of Quinaserin. At first, they tried to attract the support of the Qassil leader Al-Samirs, then under siege in Zagros, but he refused, fearing that Abd al-Rashid would like to make himself effective ruler, so they turned to the opposition Yemenis for support. In the early autumn of 755, after more than 5 years on the run, Abdul al-Rashid crossed to al-Malikia on the southern coast of Al-Andalusica. At first, he was given refuge in the nearby homes of his Mayawa, Ibn Khalid and Abu Uthan, protected by 300 horsemen. After the attempt to reach a compromise with Yusuf Ifis and al-Salim, Abdul al-Rashid began to make contact with the Yemen leaders throughout the south. By the next spring, 756, he had recruited an army of about 2,000 Umayyad Mayawans and Yemen Judids and marched on Cordoba. Here his supporters fought and defeated the questionable army of Yusuf and al-Sumid, and in May 756 he entered the capital. The proclamation of Abdul al-Rashid B. Mubarakad as Amir in the Mosque of Cordoba on Friday, 14th of May 756, was not the end of the Umayyad seizure of power in Andalusia, but only the end of the beginning. The new Amir was determined to build up a secure power base in the Al-Andalusians, which would enable him to survive and pass on the title to his descendants in a way previous governors had been able to do. He also intended to establish himself as an independent ruler after the first year. He no longer had names of the Abyssinian caliphs on the east acknowledged in the Friday prayers in Cordoba, and whilst he retained the fairly modest title of Amir, he acknowledged no temporal superior. Abd al-Rashid had a number of advantages over his rivals for power. He was a member of the Prophet's tribe of Quraysh and of the family of the Umayyad caliphs. No one could deny his high descent. On the other hand, there were many other Qurayshis in Al-Andalusia, notably Yusuf al-Firas himself, and the Umayyad caliphs had been violently and completely rejected by the Eastern Islamic world, which might have encouraged sympathy among the Syrians of Al-Andalusia, but not much respect. The Umayyads were very much outsiders as well. As far as we can tell, no member of the extended clan had ever visited Al-Andalusia before. Abdul al-Rashid's father, Muawiyah, had died when he was a boy and had not played an important role in the late Umayyad Caliphate, and he himself was still a young man of 26 with no real political experience. This is basically a young Andalusian king to be. He was an emir at the time, coming into Spain and trying to build relations. This is before Spain had even built its caliphate, because there was a time period when there were two caliphates. So as they're moving forward, he's being very cautious, very, very trepid with what he's doing, who he's stepping on, learning the local politics very quickly. In addition to the reputation being an Umayyad, it did bring Abu al-Rashid a decisive advantage in terms of a small but committed band of supporters and the opportunity to recruit more. The band of supporters consisted of the Umayyad Mayawa in Andalusia, with whom Bad had originally made contact, notably Abu Thuma, his son-in-law Abd Allah bi Khalid, and Yusuf bi Barkatu. To those who added Abd al-Kamin and Abd al-Malik, grandsons of one of the leaders of the original conquest of Spain. Mukrab al-Rimi, as you said, the original conquest of Spain. This guy is very important because later on, this branch of the Umayyad family dies off and al-Malik's family marries the last Umayyad daughter. Still carrying the Umayyad name and dynasty, but the bloodline itself physically changed. Grandsons of one of the leaders of the original conquest of Spain, Murgad al-Ramid himself said to have been a Malwan of the Umayyad Caliph al-Wid, and Tayman bi al-Qis, who was probably a member of the Malwi of Thaqwan. We don't know that. That's theory. And Tamid bin al-Qim was also who was probably a member of the Malwin of Talquis, a tribe whose close ties to the Umayyads. The Malwis seem to have had an extended possessions in Cordoba and the lands of El and Reyes, but they had little prestige in the tribal politics rivalries which dominated Al-Andalusia, and the arrival of the Umayyads gave them their only hope of real political power. But this group was not restricted to Al-Andalusians. There were Umayyad Maoris in other parts of the Muslim world who would be keen to come and support the new regime. In addition to the Umayyawa, many members of the Umayyad family continued to arrive from the east, and they too were committedly supportive of the new Amir. The most important of these was Abdul al-Malik bi Umar bi Marwan. It was he who advised Abdul al-Rashid to drop the name of the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur from the Friday prayers, and he became governor of Seville and one of the Emir's most reliable generals. In this way, Abdul al-Rashid built up a following based on the Mayawe and his own clan and geographical centre in Cordoba and the southeast that transcended the tribal followings which his opponents could command and which was entirely dedicated to his success. None of his rivals could achieve that. Abdul al-Rashid bin Marwaya was to reign as emir for 33 years after his proclamation at Cordoba, and the length of his rule was a major factor in the success of the Umayyads. If he had died or been killed, as many other governors had been after a few years, the Umayyad regime would not have doubtedly have fallen in epitaph predecessors into obscurity. This is a reality. Him staying alive and keeping his stuff together was a key factor in much of the Umayyads' survivability. People started to respect effectively their Muslim kings. If he had died, Abdul al-Rashid embarked on a policy of ensuring that he was acknowledged as emir throughout the whole peninsula, but he's faced many rivals in Al-Andalus. In the Arab chronicles, these are the documentations you should pay attention to when you're speaking of the Al-Andalusians. With their marked Umayyad Cordovan sympathies, those who resisted are portrayed as rebels against the legitimate Umayyad authority. In reality, they were local chiefs or strongmen attempting to preserve their influence against expanding and encroaching Umayyad power. The previous emirs of Cordoba had little cohesive power beyond the strength of their own following. Real influence in the province remained in the hands of the leaders of the Juds, or the other local notables. One of them, Abdul al-Rashid's main objectives was to expand the authority of Cordoba throughout the Muslim-held areas of the Iberian Peninsula. You see, his entire life work was reconnecting all of these various Juds and local. They were basically townships in a modern term, that they were connecting them with roads, connecting them in governments, connecting them, dealing with disputes. He was giving a centralised government in an extremely decentralised Muslim area at the time. In these circumstances, it is hardly surprising that many people resented the attempts of the early Umayyad emirs to rob them of their autonomy and impose a measure of civil and physical control over them. Now, again, they didn't see the grasp of what this would gain them later. This was very short-sightedness of the Juds themselves during this time period. The Syrian Jews were not proprietary owners. Lands had to be confiscated from the Baldans and the Christians. It was at this time that the bulk of the estates of Count Ardris were confiscated, and probably that the area covered by the pact with Themina were opened up for Muslim settlements. Abdul al-Rashid's first problem was to destroy the power of his predecessor, Yusuf al-Firid and al-Simid, who still remained in the field despite their recent defeats. At first, a compromise was arranged and Yusuf was able to keep his possessions and reside in Cordoba, but it appeared that he soon found this intolerable, and he escaped to Merida, where he raised a large army of Bourbons. However, he was defeated by troops loyal to Abu al-Rasmin in 759-60, was murdered near Toledo. The Firs enjoyed extensive support among the Bebians and were the only family who could rival the Umayyads. They were not to give up easy. It was 7 years before Abdul al-Rashid felt strong enough to challenge their hold on the Toledo. In 764, he sent two of his most trusted commanders, Badir and Tamid Abi al-Quin, against the city, where Hisman bi Ushad al-Firis was holding out, and he was captured and executed. There were at least two other attempts by Fira to establish themselves in the peninsula. The first of these came in 778 and 79, when Abdul al-Rashid bi Hamun al-Firis, known as the Slav from his blonde complexion and blue eyes. Remember, Andalusicans went nuts. If they could catch white slaves, and I know that's politically incorrect, but that was the time period they were in, and they were blonde and blue-eyed, they had an enormous level of dinar, as in monetary cost. A blonde female or male slave could reach 1,000 dinars easily. Bebian supporters then, in the autumn of 785, almost at the end of the Al-Asus regime, Yusuf al-Firz's son Muhammad gathered an army in the Toledo area. Defeated by the Umayyad troops, he fled west towards Korea, where he was isolated and killed. Abdul al-Rashid went on to chastise the Nasrian Bebians in the area, presumably because they had supported the rebel. The Fir felt that they had as good a claim to Al-Andalus as the Umayyads, and they could mobilise widespread support among the Bebians, but they seem to have been no match for the Umayyads, Mayawa, and their allies among the Syrian Juds. The Syrian Juds outnumbered the Bebian Juds, let's be honest about this. I mean, to be fair, the Al-Andalusicans are stock in genetics, mostly Syrian in nature. Another threat was posed by agents of the Abyssinian Caliph Ab-Jafar al-Muskar. Al-Muskar made one serious attempt to regain control of Andalusia in 763. He sent no troops, but a standard and a diploma of investiture as Emir of Al-Andalusia. The local leader was Al-Asu bi Al-Magras Al-Yusuf from Beja in southern Portugal, who gathered a large number of supporters in the west of Al-Andalusia. Abdul al-Rashmin left Cordoba and moved west to the powerful fortress at Cameroon, high up on the hills, where the castle still dominated the surrounding plains. Here he fought what was probably the most desperate encounter of his reign. The chronicle Ibn Harrison takes up the story. Now, like I said, keep paying attention when you look historically into the Umayyad period. Look at the Arabic chronicles. Look at the Arabic materials. Try to steer clear of the Crusader, conquistador period mentality, because it did an enormous amount of damage. They lied. They fabricated much of their material. Where are we? 15 minutes. He fortified himself there with his Mayawa, his faithful supporters, and the rest of his men, and Al-Aqran al-Magras began to close investment. When he had besieged the town for many days and the siege dragged on, Alau's army began to get restless. Abdul al-Rashmi knew that they were impatient and thinking of bridles and saddles, and he ordered a fire to be built and ordered his companions to burn the scabbards of their swords and said to them, "Come out with me against this crowd, determined never to return." There were 700 of them, courageous men and famous heroes, so they took their swords in their hands, searched for their enemies. The battle lasted long, until God did he marvel work, and the army and companions of Al-Aqwa quaked and fled, and their fate became a warning for the people of the world. Al-Aqwas was among the first to be killed. Only by such a desperate actions did the Umayyad Emirate survive. The dead head of the defeated rebel was embalmed and sent east with a merchant, who left it on one night with a note attached in the markets of Queren, the nearest Abyssinian outpost in Tunisia. Others accounts say it was taken to Medina and left outside the Caliph's tent. When Al-Maghrib was informed, he is said to have remarked, "Well, all belongs to God. We sent this miserable man to his death. Praise be to God, who has put the sea between me and this devil." It hardly needs to be said that this imaginative story appears only in Andalusian histories and finds no place in Abyssinian chronicles. This debacle meant the end of the direct Abyssinian interference. After this, there was an exchange of abusive correspondence, but the Umayyads of Spain posed no real threat to the Baghdad regime, and the Abyssinians would soon preoccupy with problems much nearer home. The rebels of Al-Andalus and Al-Murs were fueled by local grievances as well as Abyssinian encouragement. Abdul al-Rashmi was determined to assert his power over the Syrian Jurids before the coming of the Umayyads. The leaders, Rashid Pil and Ruqa of the Jurids, were either self-appointed or chosen by their followers. They were effectively independent and could make war or alliances as they saw fit. Abdul al-Rashid sent out a replace the old-style leaders with his own supporters. The clear example of this came in from the Jurids of Egypt and Hinds settled in Baja and Service. It seems that the Abdul al-Rashid had appointed the Umayyad Abdul al-Marak and Umar bin Maras as governors of Seville, the west. That this was resented by local leaders who felt that this was the encroachment of their power. Al-Andalus had attracted widespread support in the area, and Abdul al-Rashmin is said to have been worried that the soldiers from Seville in his own army would desert to the rebel cause. In 766, one Sayyid Malmagus rebelled in Nispers and took over Seville before being killed by the emir. In the same year, he had another leader from the area, Abdul Yahya al-Yusuf, executed in Cordoba. The dead men followers sought revenge. The people of Seville joined his cousins in an attempt to take Cordoba by surprise. It was not until 774 that the rebellion was finally defeated by Abdul al-Malik Umar. This seemed to have completed the defeat of the Jutes leaders in the area and the subject to the effective control of Cordoba. Remember, these Jews were independent powers when they raided and then took over with the Umayyads' permission. So the Umayyads kind of set this up. Let them be autonomous, take over the land, Islamic rule. Yeah, fantastic, forget it. Now that we actually have to go over there and build centralised command, it's a whole different business, because at that point the Al-Andalusians were not that centralised. They were incredibly decentralised. Each town basically ran its own business. And there was a governor. Yeah, we recognise him. Friday prayer. Yeah, give praise to the governor and the caliph. And they went back to their own lives. Whereas the Al-Andalusians, the future of the Al-Andalusian monarchy, coming from the Umayyads, worked extremely hard to centralise the power base and bring about the actual changes that were necessary. Alhamdulillah. I'm going to stop there because that's an excellent place for me to actually pause, relatively speaking. and I'm quite pleased about that position, relatively speaking. The nuances that you're seeing in the early Al-Andalusian period, where the Abyssinians and the Umayyads have already finished giving explosions of blows. There was considerable virile disagreement between the two sides, but you can ascertain that it wasn't exactly all peaches and cream. We're about 11% through the book, and I'm quite comfortable with what we've got here, alhamdulillah. I am going to finish this book on the YouTubes. I will likely do another 20-minute probably tonight because I missed one yesterday, or I might do it tomorrow after I come back from work. Alhamdulillah, it has been a pleasure speaking to you.